Our ancient ancestors were every bit as inventive and resourceful as we are today. They just demonstrated it in different ways and used different materials in their inventiveness. If you doubt the genius of the inventors of the ancient world, those doubts will have disappeared by the end of this video. We've all heard of the famous Silk Road of antiquity, but did it have a smaller Israeli equivalent? That's the theory of the archaeologists who found these stunning ancient fabrics in a trash heap in the Nahal Omer archaeological site in the Awava. These printed scraps of cloth and fabric are around 1,300 years old, and in the eyes of some scholars, they point to the existence of an Israeli Silk Road connecting Israel to India and China. That's because the fabrics aren't Israeli in origin, and must instead have been imported from places like Nubia and India, but perhaps also through trade with China. Some of the scraps of silk are marked with an ikat design, which can be traced to the wall paintings of India's Ajanta caves. It's rare to find ikat designs from this period in the Middle East. The Nabatean incense road was gone by the time of the early Islamic period, so these ikat fabrics must have come from somewhere else. The Israeli Silk Road would likely have been a mere extension of the larger Silk Road, but even so, it makes what was already an enormous ancient trade network even bigger. If we asked you to think of a suit of armor, you'd probably think of a knight riding a horse in a clanking suit of metal. You almost certainly wouldn't think of anything that looks like the Kiribati armor. Armor like this, in so much as it can even be called armor, is exclusive to the independent Republic of Kiribati in the Pacific Ocean. It's made from woven coconut fibers, which hold the remains of aquatic animals in place so as to afford the wearer a basic degree of protection. Historians think that Kiribati was first founded around 5,000 years ago. Its people are known for their seafaring abilities and their habit of building large communal buildings called maniaba. It's difficult for experts to pin down the historical provenance of the armor because the people had no written language. What's known of their history comes from an oral tradition that was suppressed for centuries by European colonists. Some of those oral traditions say that the armor was worn for ritual one-on-one combat to settle disputes over territory and resources, during which the participants would take turns to wound each other. It sounds brutal. In December 2021, scientists and archaeologists in Russia undertook a re-examination of artifacts discovered in Dtyasar, Kazakhstan during the Soviet era. They didn't know what they expected to find, but this one in particular jumped out at them. One of their 4th century lyres looked almost identical to a lyre that was found at the famous site of Sutton Hoo in England. This is surprising for 2 reasons. The first is that Sutton Hoo is a 7th century site, so the Kazakhstan lyre is far older. The second is that it suggests either immigration to England from Eastern Europe between the 4th and 7th centuries, or a direct Eastern influence on Anglo-Saxon culture. When the lyre was first found at Sutton Hoo during the 1930s, it was the first time the musical instrument had ever been discovered in the modern world. For that reason, it became known as the Anglo-Saxon lyre. Now that it's been proven that the same instrument existed in Kazakhstan long before it was included in the grand burial of an unknown Anglo-Saxon king in England, it might have to be renamed the Kazakhstan lyre. Has a nice ring to it. Human beings have been interested in stargazing since time immemorial. That's something we can see clearly at Cheonseongdae in Gyeongju, South Korea, which is thought to be the oldest observatory in the world. The distinctive structure was built back in the 7th century era of the Silla Kingdom, and there are some who believe the building is full of encoded information. For a start, the Cheonseongdae is made from precisely 362 granite blocks. That's 1 block for each day in the lunar calendar. The granite blocks create 27 layers, which may be a reference to the fact that Queen Seondeok, who was on the throne when Cheonseongdae was built, was the 27th ruler of the Silla Kingdom. Count the number of layers above and below the building's single window, and you'll get 12 in each direction. which could be one for every month of the year or one for every sign of the zodiac. The tower is entirely circular, except for the base, which is square. That's 4 sides, one for every season. Numerical symbology clearly mattered to whoever built Cheomseongdae, but we don't know if we're reading too much into it. Alternatively, perhaps there's more information to decode that nobody's worked out yet. All astronomical clocks are complicated creations, but the astronomical clock of Prague is an especially impressive example of such a device, and one that's been given a near mystical status. Nobody seems to know the real story behind the invention of the clock, but most local legends say it was built by the hands of Mikuláš of Kadaň at some point during the 14th century. He wasn't well rewarded for his work. The local authorities liked his work so much that they're said to have blinded Mikuláš so he couldn't make another clock for any other town or city. In an act of vengeance intended to destroy his own creation, Mikuláš allegedly hurled himself into the clock's mechanisms, ending his own life in the process. If that ever happened at all, the clock survived the unusual attack. It's still fully functional today, and still shows Babylonian time and Old Bohemian time, as well as the current time in this part of Europe. South Korea has attempted to build an identical clock, but theirs lacks some of the charms and quirks of this impossible-to-imitate original. During the peak of the Roman army's powers, we imagine that being attacked by its soldiers was a bad enough experience without being psychologically tormented at the same time. On the other hand, psychological warfare might have been one of the reasons the Romans were so successful. They didn't only want to defeat you physically, they also wanted to break you mentally. To do so, they used unconventional weapons like this. They're whistling sling stones, designed to make noise as they sped through the air toward you some 1,800 years ago. The most recently discovered set of whistling stones was found in Lockerbie, Scotland in August 2021. The tiny holes drilled in each of the stones served a dual purpose. They would first make injuries worse because of their compressive effect on impact, and they also made a dreadful noise as thousands of them whistled through the air at the same time. The noise is said to have terrified the native Scottish tribes when they faced the Romans on the battlefield. It's known that there was an enormous battle between the Scots and the Romans on nearby Burnswark Hill during the 2nd century. These stones are almost certainly a leftover from that battle. Let's look at the magnetic compass, which can be traced all the way back to China 2,400 years ago. The type of compass used back then works in almost the same way as the compasses we use today, but their inventor didn't originally devise them as navigation aids. Instead, they thought that they'd created something that would be useful in an energy channeling process similar to feng shui. This was a device that told you where to go spiritually and figuratively, not literally. It's thought that the compass was used to determine where doors and windows would best be built in houses and other properties. The compasses of the era were made from lodestone, a form of rock that's also a natural magnet and perfectly aligned with the Earth's magnetic field. The stone would be fashioned into a spoon-like shape and then placed on a bronze plate. We're not sure how many years passed before the ancient Chinese noticed that the tip of the spoon always pointed perfectly to the north, but their ancient texts also contain references to a so-called iron fish, which was said to always point south when placed into a bowl of water. Sadly, no examples of such a device have survived to the modern day. By this stage in the video, we should all be very clear that our ancient ancestors were capable of more than we generally give them credit for. Surely, though, they couldn't have come up with a way of refrigerating food. Actually, they did. You might think that it's impossible to create a refrigerator without electricity, but you'd be wrong. The Persians had refrigerator units 2,400 years ago, and they called them yakchals. There's a clue to their purpose in the name, which translates into English as ice pits, but it's a bad translation. Yakchals aren't pits. They're more like giant tents. The Persians built their yakchals 60 feet high, and channeled water into them from nearby springs. The water was then cooled by using wind catchers, and a cooling system based on evaporation removed heat and moisture. To finish things off, the exterior of each yakchal was coated with thick layers of sand, clay, egg whites, and goat hair to reflect the heat of the sun and ensure the contents remained chilled. We imagine those outer surfaces gave off an incredible stink, but so long as they kept the food inside them fresh, they were doing their job. The art of making clothes is one of the very oldest in human history, but it had to begin somewhere. Perhaps we can get some insights into its origins by checking out this September 2021 discovery from Katahoya in Turkey. Archaeologists are already aware that this is an unusual part of the world because as many as 10,000 people lived here together 9,000 years ago. Settling down permanently wasn't standard behavior during that point in the Stone Age, but these people did, and by doing so, they created the largest known settlement from the Neolithic era. They also left behind a few scraps of textiles and fabrics for us to find. The most controversial of them was discovered in 1962. It's a small scrap of cloth that some experts have suggested might be made of wool or linen. In fact, as of September 2021, we know that it's made of oak fibers called bast. As such, it's the oldest preserved woven fabric in the world. We've long believed that when our ancestors started making clothes rather than wearing animal skins, they used linen as their default material. Based on the age of this fabric, which was created at least 8,500 years ago, it now seems that the first human-made clothes may have been made from bast. Many people view pigeons as a nuisance, but would you feel differently about an artificial pigeon powered by steam? You could at least rest assured that it wasn't about to use you as a toilet. As hard as this might be to believe, the steam-powered pigeon was designed 2,300 years ago in Tarentum, Magna Graecia, which is now in southern Italy. Its inventor was Archytas, a noted inventor of his era who was also a noted military strategist, astronomer, mathematician, and politician. As his steam pigeon was self-propelled, you could say that he's the true inventor of powered flight. Achieving flight isn't what Archytas had in mind when he invented his wooden device, though. He saw it as a way of studying birds more closely. His design is simple yet effective. An opening at the back of the pigeon leads to its internal bladder, which in turn is connected to an airtight boiler. As the boiler generated steam, the pressure eventually overcame the resistance of the connection, and the pigeon shot off into the air. An average flight covered around 3,800 feet. As well as being the first flying device, you could say that Archytas's pigeon was a type of 2,300-year-old robot. The idea of a naturally occurring nuclear reactor sounds ridiculous, yet it exists. It's called the Oklo reactor, and you'll find it in Munana, Gabon. This is the first, and as far as anyone knows, only natural nuclear reactor in the world. About 2 billion years ago, the region's uranium-rich mineral deposits flooded with groundwater and set off a nuclear chain reaction that sustained itself for years, generating energy that raised the temperature inside the deposits so high that all the water in the area boiled away. Every time the temperature dropped below boiling point, the nuclear reactions would begin again. We can prove this because of the presence of xenon gas in the surrounding rock, which is a byproduct of uranium fission. The reactions continued until the fissile uranium was entirely depleted. When the low levels of isotope U-238 in the rock were first noticed during the 1970s, it was briefly feared that someone had stolen the uranium to create a nuclear weapon. But against all the odds, it turned out that the phenomenon had a natural explanation. There's theoretically nothing to stop this from happening again somewhere else in the world. Kalmar is a city in the southeast of Sweden, and its location is so strategically important that a war was fought over it between 1611 and 1613. The Kalmar War was a conflict between Sweden and the unified nations of Denmark and Norway, and this recently discovered sword was used as a weapon in it. The long-forgotten blade was found in Kalmar at the bottom of a stone cellar, which might once have belonged to a farm that existed here during the medieval era. The farm was attacked during the war and burned down in 1611, but the fire and ash helped to preserve things trapped beneath it. Experts in Sweden say that the sword is significant because it demonstrates a leap forward in sword-making technology. The style of the weapon would have been brand new at the time it was lost, but it became the template for sword designs that dominated European battlefields throughout the 17th century, and until more advanced weapons made swords obsolete. As for the war, it was briefly won by the Danes, but they were never able to quell the people of Kalmar, so it was handed back as part of the peace treaty that brought the conflict to an end. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!